Okay, so we have the stars of the day, I feel. So I don't know, no pressure. So we've got Georgina and Meredith, who are both people who were born through surrogacy, to talk about their experiences and maybe some reflections on what they think works well and maybe what needs a bit more thought. So I wonder if, to start off, if you're happy to just share the summary of your background, so how your parents decided what route to parenthood they were going to take, and then how that's manifested through your lives, and then later we'll perhaps reflect a bit on how that's felt and what advice you maybe can give to parents to be. So I don't know if are you happy to start, Meredith, or yeah.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Meredith, and I was born in 1989 through straight surrogacy via an organisation called COTS, which is Childlessness Overcome Through Surrogacy. Before my obviously successful surrogacy journey, my parents did try for adoption, but found the process to be, for them, back 30-ish years ago, quite lengthy and stressful. So they decided to go down the route of surrogacy, and I think I've been very lucky because I've had a very, very successful story, a very open and honest story. I have a good relationship with what I call my birth mum and also her family and her other children. She didn't have any other surrogates, just me. And yeah, we stay in touch, text, video calls, Christmas cards. She doesn't live near to me geographically, so we don't see each other quite as much as we would do if we lived nearer, but yeah, a great relationship, and with my half-siblings too. My parents, mum and dad, who brought me up, have been fantastic. There's never really been, I think a lot of people ask me, well, how did you know? When did you find out? Like there's this big mysterious mist lifted one day in like the Jeremy Kyle show, oh, you're not my mother, blah, blah, blah. Not like that at all for me. Everyone's always been very open and honest, and I think for me personally that's worked very, very well. So I've just always known that there's a birth mum out there and her family, and I'm able to ask them questions, and yeah, it's all been really for me a very happy story. And now I'm kind of at that age where I'm thinking about having my own children. The question's been posed to me, would I do surrogacy? I think at this point it's too early to say, but I've seen that it can be very successful. Obviously, G's going to tell you her story shortly, but I know lots of other children, or that are now adults, through COTS, and again, lots of really, really successful stories. It's not without some stresses and some things that can be a little bit emotional, I would say, and trying to explain to people that don't know about surrogacy how I was born and the various other siblings can be complicated, but other than that, just requires an extra 5 minutes rather than just, yes, I've got a brother or sister. It's no, I've got half brothers and half sisters, and my mum had a child in her first marriage as well. So yes, lots of us around, but yeah, I've had a successful journey, and yeah, very, very grateful to COTS as well. So yeah.
Thank you. And what about you, Georgina?
Hi everyone. So I am Georgina. I was born in 1998 through traditional surrogacy, through the organisation called COTS, so the same as Meredith. My parents met in their late 30s, tried for children, had IVF, the kind of usual workup that heterosexual couples often have to get to the point of surrogacy, and none of that had been successful. And in some of their rounds of IVF, they'd actually used donor eggs. So when that had failed, their obstetrician recommended that they look at surrogacy as an option. And for them, when I've spoken to them about it, it seemed like the really logical next step, because they'd already taken that psychological move to accepting that my mother might not be biologically related to me by using donor eggs. So they went to COTS, matched with my surrogate. My surrogate had, at that point, one son of her own, who was 4, and had one surrogate baby, a boy who was 2. And I think that was quite reassuring for my parents that she'd already done a journey of surrogacy in the UK through COTS and was kind of established in that network. And I was born in 98, and then she had a subsequent son after me. So I have 3 half-brothers, one of whom is also surrogate baby, and 2 who are half-brothers who are my surrogate's own children. Again, I have a similar story to Meredith. I was very lucky to be told from very early age. I've always known about surrogacy. There wasn't a day I was sat down and this secret had been unearthed or anything like that. And it's just always been my normal. So just like everyone here is taught, you might have a mum and a dad, or 2 dads or 2 mums, and that's your normal. I had my mum and my dad and then my surrogate, and that was my normal. And it's never been, in that sense, scary or complicated at all, which is lucky and brilliant from my perspective to have that honesty, which is really, really important. We keep in touch with my surrogate family and her family. I see my half brothers, and that's always been quite open and never been a problem. And in fact, getting married this year, and all of my surrogate family will be there, so we have quite a good and close relationship. Again, some difficulties, I think, and as we'll go on to in a moment, I'm sure, but I'm very happy to answer any questions. And yeah, I think overall it's been a positive experience, lot to learn, and just good to be able to share things with everyone in the room. So we'll open it up to them.
Thank you so much, and it's really, I think it's really, we're incredibly grateful that you're willing to share your stories and talk about this and answer questions. So what's interesting is that, so both of you have surrogates who are also the egg donors, and I suppose that is slightly different to a lot of people who are considering surrogacy. They'll either be using their own eggs or they'll be using a separate egg donor. And I just wonder, it's possibly hard to know, but whether you feel that whether you think that's been of a significance for you, and I wonder whether your parents also have you clearly have close relationships with your surrogates, and whether your parents have also had that sort of relationship, and whether you feel that that's been part of you feeling so secure that actually it sounds like everybody's very secure in the story.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that first. So in terms of the significance of the kind of biological relationship with my surrogate, I think that is significant in my story. So my mum is 5'0", fair, blue eyes, gingery blondie hair, and my surrogate looks very much like me. And I think that the physicalities sometimes are quite relevant in the story, because I think parents like to look at their children and see parts of them in them. And I think sometimes that can be hard for mothers that are not genetically connected to the children. So I think in my story that has been potentially relevant, although from my perspective, my mum's my mum, and that, it's not, doesn't work in that direction. I don't look at her and go, don't look like you, so you're not my mum. But I think the other way round, I think when you think about having your own children, you think of them resembling you physically in some ways. But we were talking about this outside, and there are lots of characteristics and mannerisms and behaviour that you learn from your parents, and you get those traits from your mum. So I think in that regard, you get different bits from everybody. In terms of security, I would say that my parents have always been quite secure in their surrogacy journey. They've always spoken about it. It's mainly been my dad that spoke about it, because he's quite an open kind of guy, and I suspect for the dads sometimes it's a little bit easier to be open because they're a little bit less involved in having those challenges emotionally. But I know that my mum's always there. If I want to talk to her about it, she will talk about it with me, but she's less likely to volunteer up the conversation. But I would say definitely in terms of being born through surrogacy, it's very reassuring to have parents who are confident in their position as your parent, and that's really important from my perspective, and also been something that my half-brother's really found, in that his mum is so secure in her role as his mum that there's never been any doubt in our minds as to who our parents are, so that's been really important for us.
I don't really have much to add, but really to just almost confirm and agree with what Georgina said, is that my parents have always had a close relationship and still do with my surrogate mum and their families. So, yeah, I don't think there have really been any issues. Like Georgina says, it's sometimes odd, I think, for our mums to look at us and not look like them, but apparently when I was born, my mum and my surrogate mum looked at each other and just went, well, she looks like my dad. I look like my dad. So no test needed there. So, but yeah, and I definitely have a lot of my mum's mannerisms that I've picked up from being around her. She's the only mum I've ever known and the only person I would ever call my mum. My surrogate mum, or my birth mum, is a lady that's very significant in my life and very important to me. But mum and dad raised me, their family, in that respect. And yeah, that's it on that one.
Lovely. I'm just wondering whether you're obviously now adults and confident enough to share your story in this way. Were there times, maybe teenage years can be notorious for throwing up sort of identity questions and who am I and you're not my parents anyway sort of conversations. Did you either of you go through anything like that, or go through phases where you felt either less confident about it all or just had more questions about it, where you were trying to work out what it all means?
I think for me it wasn't teenage years, it's actually more now, because I'm 32 and a bit now. I want to have my own family, and I think that's a really current thing for me now, actually, to spend more time with my parents and also my surrogate mum, from all perspectives, to know what could happen for me with my family in the future from a biological side, but also from kind of the psychology of growing up with my parents. So for me, it's now as an adult, but when I was a child, not far too well behaved for anything like that. And I think, you know, and I, you know, you see it on the soaps, people saying, "Oh, you're not my mother," and it's, for me, no, that would be the very, very last thing I would ever say to my mum and dad, for sure, absolutely. But things get said in the heat of the moment, and I think even though words are painful, they still know the truth. They know deep down in my core, they're my mum and dad. That's it. And yeah, I'm sure you might throw a strop and get angry, but that's our story and our beliefs with it, so to speak.
So I would say I had a little bit maybe of a different experience during those teenage years. So my parents split when I was 14, and I would say that threw a little bit of a curveball, and their split and their divorce was not to do with surrogacy. But I would say at that point the surrogacy became a little bit more difficult in my life, because when they split, there was a lot of hurt between them as a couple. And because my mum didn't necessarily feel the same connection to me that my dad feels, because he's biologically related to me and I look like him and I'm very similar to him, I think she found that more painful than if I had been their genetic child between the both of them. And that's why I mentioned earlier the relevance of the child's perspective compared to the adult's perspective, because from my side, there was never any other mum and there would never be. But I think, as you say, things get said in the heat of the moment between adults and children, and you know, those things can be difficult and painful, and when there's added stresses of family stuff going on that's not necessarily related to surrogacy but no doubt puts pressure on everybody involved, that can become difficult, and it's another layer of challenge. I don't think it ever made me question my identity, but it made times more difficult in terms of establishing those relationships with my parents as individuals once they had separated, because of the relevance or the genetic kind of similarities in physique and in behaviour to my dad. But those times are changing in many ways. You know, surrogacy now is more often than not gestational surrogacy or with donor eggs, as Nina said. And those issues perhaps are less relevant in those scenarios because there are those genetic connections anyway. But I think, we wave the flag here as people who are massive advocates of surrogacy, but it doesn't come without difficulties and challenges, and I think it would be naive to think it did. So being really aware of those and open about those is really important.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like the two important things were that both of your parents sound like both sets of parents were confident in their role as parents and their choice to have you through surrogacy, but also that they told you from an early age. Did you understand that you were genetically related to the surrogate from that, or was that just a sort of an assumption, or did that have to be clarified more precisely later on in the conversation?
So my parents always explained my surrogate to me as my tum mum, so that I came from her tummy, and that always made sense. And I don't think I ever questioned the genetics because I just maybe assumed them. But that's an interesting question if it had been donor eggs with a surrogate, and I don't know how that would work. I guess you'd have to explain that as you explain surrogacy generally. The only question I ever had for my parents throughout the whole of surrogacy in terms of confusion was when I was about 10 and I'd got my head around my birth mum or surrogate and the genetics there and about my mum, and I was explaining it to a friend at school, primary school, and she said, I get all of that, that makes sense, that's fine, but who's your dad? And that was the only point I ever got confused, because I suddenly had an afternoon at school where I thought, hang on, if my mum could be in different ways, lots of different people in different roles, so could my dad, and no one's ever mentioned anything about that. And I went home and I asked my mum, and she was like, well, your dad's your dad. And I was like, oh, okay, that's fine, that's clarified that one, nice and simple. So I'd say that was the only thing I ever had to ask my parents about kind of biology or kind of status in the family, was about who my dad was, which was really strange in surrogacy when it's so focused about, the mum's role. So that was the only thing I had to clarify.
Just to pick up on something there, our charity, the Donor Conception Network, we're very focused on openness, building confident parents who make confident decisions, but also telling and talking. And we've started running. We're working more with surrogacy families who've used egg donation or sperm donation, and it's quite interesting that they'll often come to us and they have had to be open about the surrogacy side with friends and family and with their child very often, but they are much less comfortable about sharing the fact that they or don't know quite how to start integrating the fact that they used a sperm donor or an egg donor into that story, and that's partly why I wonder, because I think there is an assumption if you're open about the surrogacy, quite often people will just assume either they'll assume you've used your own eggs and just use a surrogate, or they'll assume that the child might well assume that the surrogate is their genetic mum, and if that's not the case, then it can be tricky to weave that into the conversation later. But what about you, Meredith?
I think for me, if anybody could take away one thing from my journey as a surrogate baby, would be to just be open to the fullest and be honest all the time. Even when they're in the tummy, just say, I'm your mum and dad. And from the very beginning, even when the children probably don't understand what you're saying. So from that very moment, it's easy. You've said it out loud. That's your narrative from the very, very beginning. I think the only difficulty, not real difficulty, but the only odd thing with me is that sometimes, again, because I'm a little bit older than G, so surrogacy was really still quite new back 30 odd years ago. And people didn't really understand. They just thought my dad had gone and had sex with some other woman, which isn't the case, but it almost is. And in some ways, it's easier to explain. Yes, my dad and another lady had a baby, and then I came home with mum and dad. So, yeah, it depends how you look at it. But I mean, again, it's down to the individual what terms you use, whether it's tummy mummy or things like that, or birth mum or surrogate mum. I think as long as you choose and you all agree, and that's what you stick to, that's your story, that's your narrative, that's what's really important. And like I said, just please be open and honest from the start. Don't wait till the right time to tell the child. I don't think, in my personal opinion, that wouldn't work.
I'll just do a quick plug. We have some great books. We publish books as well as all sorts of other things. And we have a series of books for children called Our Story, How We Became a Family. And we've got a whole range, including surrogacy scenarios. So whether you've used a donor egg or your own eggs or sperm donor. So they're always very helpful for finding ways to frame the story.
That's great.
Should we do some questions? Have we got time for some questions?
Sure. Any other questions I want to ask these guys about their sense of self or anything?
Don't all rush at once.
Yeah,
we
there's
won't
one
buy.
there.
How was it when you were growing up, when you were young? Did it present any problem with other kids in school? Because kids very well know from being worried.
I mean, I'm ginger, so I just got taunted with Carrot Top all the time. So, you know, who my mum and dad were was probably the least of my worries. But no, I think all of my friends now, and all of my friends even at school, they all know my story. And I never had any problems. I think maybe because I don't think any of my friends of such have probably met my surrogate mum's family. So that may have been more confusing for children back then. But no, for me, no problems at all.
Yeah, I've never had any problems at school. I think by default, the fact we're here, I think we're both fairly confident about our stories. I think kids at school generally like to pick on things that children are not confident about. And I suspect because we fronted surrogacy out with confidence, it was never a point of weakness that anyone poked on, really. Never. And it was always understood. So at school, we were asked to draw a picture of our mums and dads at kind of preschool level, age 3 or 4. And I drew a picture of my mum and my dad and then my surrogate. But my school didn't know I was born through surrogacy. And they called my dad in because they thought that he was having an affair or something because there were 2 women and it was all a bit confusing. And they called my dad in and my parents explained. And actually the head teacher at that school had been brought into her family by adoption. And I think there was a lot of connection at that point with the school about it. So I would say it's relevant to talk with the school about because it's going to be part of your child's normal. And if they're going to talk about it, people need to understand where that stuff's coming from. But in terms of interactions with other peoples, I never experienced any challenges.
Yeah. All right, that's great. Thank you guys so much. That was really great to have you guys here and come along and talk about it all. Wonderful. That's great.
Thank you.